Samuel Hale never imagined that the earthquake would reveal what had been stolen from his family for 50 years. When the ground split open that morning in Nebraska, exposing a massive industrial tunnel system beneath his farmland, he uncovered more than just corporate theft. He discovered a conspiracy that would shake the entire nation to its core. My friends, what you're about to hear is a story of courage, betrayal, and one farmer's fight against impossible odds. I invite you to follow this incredible journey to the very end, and please comment below which city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The morning of March 15th started like any other on the Hale family farm. Samuel Hale, a weathered man of 52 with calloused hands that told the story of 3 decades working the same Nebraska soil, rose before dawn. The roosters hadn't even begun their morning chorus when he pulled on his worn work boots, the leather cracked and comfortable from years of use. Outside, the pre-dawn air carried that particular chill of early spring when winter hadn't quite released its grip, but the promise of warmer days whispered through the budding trees. Samuel moved through his morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed these same tasks thousands of times before. First the chickens, their soft clucking greeting him as he scattered feed across the yard. Then the 2 dairy cows, Martha and Bessie, named by his daughter Emily, when she was just 7 years old. Now, 23 and studying agricultural science at the state university, Emily called less often than Samuel would have liked, but he understood. Young people had their own lives to build. "Morning, ladies," he murmured to the cows, his breath visible in the cool air. Martha, the older of the 2, nudged his shoulder affectionately as he settled onto the milking stool. This was his meditation, these quiet moments before the world woke up, when it was just him and the animals and the land that had been in his family for 4 generations. The Hale farm stretched across 340 acres of prime Nebraska farmland, though Samuel only actively worked about half of it these days. Since his wife Margaret had passed 3 years ago from cancer, he'd scaled back operations. The big farmhouse felt too empty without her laughter filling it, and somehow the field seemed wider, lonelier without her bringing him lunch during harvest time. But the land was in his blood, passed down from his great-grandfather, who'd claimed it in 1898, and Samuel couldn't imagine being anywhere else. He was just finishing with Bessie when it happened. The first tremor was so slight that Samuel thought one of the cows had kicked the wall. But then the milk pail began to rattle against the concrete floor, and Martha bellowed in alarm. The wooden beams of the barn groaned a sound Samuel had never heard in all his years. Then came the real shake. The ground rolled beneath his feet like an ocean wave, sending Samuel stumbling against the stall gate. Tools fell from their hooks on the wall, clattering and clanging in a chaotic symphony. Both cows were crying out now, their eyes wide with primitive fear. The earthquake, because that's what this had to be, though. Nebraska wasn't exactly known for seismic activity, lasted maybe 15 seconds, but each second stretched out like minutes in Samuel's perception. "Easy, easy," he called to the animals, though his own voice shook. His hands trembled as he quickly released both cows from their stalls, letting them rush out to the relative safety of the pasture. Through the barn's open door, he could see his chickens scattering and panic feathers flying as they squawked and flapped in confusion. When the shaking finally stopped, an eerie silence settled over the farm. Even the birds had gone quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if more was coming. Samuel's heart hammered in his chest as he steadied himself against the doorframe and looked out across his land. That's when he saw it. Where his southern field should have been 40 acres of soil he'd been preparing for corn planting, there was now a massive gash in the earth. From the barn, it looked like God himself had taken a knife and carved a wound across the landscape. The crevice had to be at least 30 feet wide and stretched for nearly 100 yards, disappearing into the tree line that marked the edge of his property. Jesus Christ. Samuel breathed the words somewhere between a prayer and a curse. He grabbed his cell phone from his pocket, his fingers fumbling with the buttons as he tried to call 911. No signal. The earthquake must have knocked out the local tower. He'd have to drive to town, report this, get someone out here to... But something made him pause. Something about the way the morning sun, just cresting the horizon now, was hitting the edge of that crevice. There was a gleam there, not like exposed rock or soil, but something else, something that didn't belong. Against every ounce of common sense telling him to stay away from the unstable ground, Samuel found himself walking toward the chasm. His boots crunched on the frost-touched grass, each step taking him closer to the edge. The normal sounds of morning were slowly returning, a tentative bird song here, the distant lowing of cattle there. But Samuel heard none of it. His entire focus was on that strange gleam. 20 feet from the edge, he slowed his approach. The ground here was spiderwebbed with smaller cracks, evidence of the violent force that had torn open the earth. He dropped to his hands and knees, crawling the last few feet with the caution of a man who'd seen enough farming accidents to respect danger. When he finally peered over the edge, what he saw defied explanation. The chasm dropped down perhaps 40 feet its walls, a geological timeline of Nebraska's history, layers of soil, clay limestone, and sandstone painted in earthen hues. But at the bottom, clearly visible even from this height, was something that absolutely should not exist. It was a tunnel. Not a natural cave or cavern, but an obviously man-made tunnel. The opening was perfectly rectangular, lined with what looked like concrete or metal, and from what Samuel could see, it extended horizontally into darkness in both directions. The gleam he'd noticed was from the tunnel's frame, some kind of metallic reinforcement that caught the morning light. Samuel sat back on his heels, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. In all the years his family had owned this land, through all the plowing and planting, the irrigation work and fence post digging, they'd never encountered anything like this. How deep did you have to go before you hit a tunnel like that 40 feet 50? And more importantly, who had built it and why? A memory surfaced unbidden. His grandfather, Hale, near the end of his life, rambling about strange sounds at night. Like machinery, the old man had said, though everyone had attributed it to his declining mental state. Deep under the ground, like something chewing through the earth. Samuel's father had dismissed it as dementia talking, and Samuel hadn't thought about those words in 20 years. Until now. He pulled out his phone again, not to call 911 this time, but to take pictures. The camera captured the crevice, the exposed tunnel, the impossible architecture beneath his family's land. As he photographed, a cold certainty settled in his stomach. This wasn't new. That tunnel had the look of something that had been there for years, decades even. The metal was weathered, showing signs of rust and age. Someone had been under his land, his family's land, for God knows how long. The sound of an approaching vehicle pulled Samuel from his thoughts. He looked up to see a familiar red pickup truck bouncing along the dirt road that led to his house. Marcus Boyd, his nearest neighbor and oldest friend, was driving with the kind of urgency that suggested he'd felt the earthquake too. Marcus parked haphazardly near the barn and jumped out his considerable bulk, moving with surprising speed for a man in his 60s. His gray beard was uncombed and he was still wearing the flannel pajama pants he'd obviously slept in, though he'd managed to throw on a jacket and boots. "Sam, Jesus, are you all right?" Marcus called out, jogging over with a slight limp from an old rodeo injury. "That quake knocked half my dishes off the shelf. Scared Helen so bad she's still shaking. I tried calling, but the phones are—" He stopped mid-sentence, noticing Samuel's position near the crevice. "What the hell is that?" "Come look at this, Marcus," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "But be careful. Ground's not stable." Marcus approached with appropriate caution, his eyes widening as he took in the size of the chasm. When he got close enough to see the tunnel at the bottom, he let out a low whistle that seemed to echo in the morning air. "That's not natural," Marcus stated the obvious, his voice hushed with disbelief. "No," Samuel agreed, "it's not." They stared at it together for a long moment. Two men who'd spent their entire lives on this land, who thought they knew every inch of it, confronted with evidence that they'd been wrong. "We need to call someone," Marcus finally said. "The authorities or—" "The phones are down," Samuel interrupted. "But Marcus, look at it. Really look at it. That tunnel's been there for years. Someone built that under my land, has been doing God knows what down there, and we never knew." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he said, "You remember when my well went dry 5 years ago?" Samuel nodded. He remembered. Marcus had to drill a new well deeper than the old one at considerable expense. "The water table shouldn't have dropped that much," Marcus continued. "The geologist I hired said it was unusual. Said it was like something had diverted the underground water flow." He paused, meeting Samuel's eyes. "What if it was this What if whatever's down there affected the water? The implications hung between them like a physical presence. If someone had been building tunnels under their land extensive enough to affect the water table, then this wasn't some small operation. This was something massive, organized, and hidden. "I'm going down there," Samuel said suddenly. The decision made before he'd even consciously considered it. Marcus grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? That's a 40-foot drop, and we don't know if the ground's stable. Another aftershock could bury you." "I've got rope in the barn," Samuel said, pulling free. "And I need to know, Marcus. This is my land, my family's land. I need to know what's down there." Marcus studied his friend's face, seeing the determination there. The same stubborn set to his jaw that had gotten them both in and out of trouble since they were kids. Finally, he sighed. "Then I'm coming with you," he said. "Helen will kill me, but I'm not letting you go down there alone." Samuel managed a small smile, the first since the earthquake. "Wouldn't expect anything less from you, you old fool." They gathered supplies from the barn, 2 coils of sturdy rope flashlights, work gloves, and Samuel's tool belt, with its assortment of useful implements. Samuel also grabbed his father's old revolver from the locked cabinet in the barn office, loading it with hands that remembered the motion from years of dealing with rabid coyotes and aggressive wild boars. He hoped he wouldn't need it, but something about that tunnel, about the deliberate secrecy of it, made him feel the weight of the gun was warranted. Marcus raised an eyebrow at the weapon, but didn't comment. Instead, he helped Samuel secure one end of the rope to the trailer hitch of his truck, testing it with their combined weight to make sure it would hold. "If something happens," Samuel said as he fashioned a crude harness from the second rope, "if there's another quake or anything else, you get out. You understand? Get out and get help." "Same goes for you," Marcus countered. "We're not heroes, Sam. We're just a couple of farmers who are probably too old to be doing this." "Speak for yourself. I'm in my prime," Samuel said with forced lightness, though they both knew the gravity of what they were about to do. Samuel went first, rappelling down the side of the crevice with more confidence than he felt. The rope burned through his gloves despite their thickness, and loose soil and rocks cascaded down with each movement. The walls of the chasm told a story in layers. The rich topsoil his family had cultivated, the clay beneath, that held water during dry seasons, then layers of rock and mineral deposits that spoke of ancient seas and prehistoric times. But it was the tunnel that held his attention as he descended. The closer he got, the more unnatural it appeared. The entrance was framed with steel beams, industrial grade, from the look of them, though rust had claimed much of their surface. The concrete lining the tunnel's mouth was cracked in places with strange dark stains that looked almost like oil residue. When Samuel's boots finally touched the bottom of the crevice, he had to catch his breath, not from exertion, but from the smell that emanated from the tunnel. It was chemical acrid, like a mixture of diesel fuel and something else, something that made his nose burn and his eyes water. "What's that smell?" Marcus called from above, apparently catching a whiff, even from that height. "I don't know," Samuel called back, pulling his shirt up over his nose and mouth. "But it's coming from the tunnel. It's strong down here." Marcus made his descent faster than Samuel had, his bulk requiring more careful rope management, but his years of physical labor serving him well. When he reached the bottom, he immediately covered his face as well. "That's petroleum," he said, his voice muffled by his jacket collar. "And something else. Chemicals. Processing chemicals, maybe." They stood at the threshold of the tunnel, their flashlight beams penetrating only a few dozen feet into the darkness beyond. The tunnel was larger than it had appeared from above, maybe 8 feet high and 10 feet wide. The floor was smooth concrete, worn down in the center, as if from regular traffic. Along the walls ran pipes and cables, their purposes unknown, but their presence undeniably industrial. "This isn't some old mining tunnel," Samuel said, running his flashlight beam along the ceiling where modern LED light fixtures hung dark and powerless. This is recent. Look at those lights. That's modern equipment." Marcus was examining one of the pipes that ran along the wall. It was about 6 inches in diameter, with joints every 20 feet or so. A dark, viscous liquid had leaked from one of the joints, pooling on the floor. "Oil," he said, after dabbing at it with a finger and smelling it. "This is an oil pipeline, Sam. Someone's been pumping oil under your land." "That's impossible," Samuel said, though the evidence was right in front of him. There's no oil in this part of Nebraska. Never has been. Maybe not that we knew about, Marcus said grimly. Or maybe they're transporting it from somewhere else. Either way, someone's been using your land without your knowledge. They ventured deeper into the tunnel, their footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. Every 100 feet or so, they passed side passages, smaller tunnels that branched off into darkness. Some had locked gates across them, industrial padlocks that looked relatively new. Others were open, revealing glimpses of machinery, tanks, and equipment that neither man could identify. About 300 feet in, they found a wider section of tunnel, almost like an underground room. Here the chemical smell was overwhelming. Large tanks lined one wall connected by a maze of pipes and valves. A control panel, dark and silent, now displayed gauges and switches labeled with codes and abbreviations that meant nothing to Samuel. But it was what they found on a desk in the corner that made Samuel's blood run cold. Maps. Dozens of them spread out and pinned to a board on the wall. Maps of his land, his neighbor's land, the entire county. And marked on these maps were tunnel routes, some solid lines indicating completed sections, others dotted to show planned expansions. The network was vast, spreading like spider webs beneath farms, homes, and towns. My God, Marcus breathed, tracing one of the tunnel routes with his finger. This goes under my property too, and the Johnsons, and the Millers. This covers half the county. Samuel was looking at something else, a logo, in the corner of each map. Kendrick Energy Corporation. He knew that name. Everyone in Nebraska did. They were one of the largest energy companies in the Midwest, with operations in oil, natural gas, and increasingly renewable energy. Their CEO, William Kendrick Jr., was a frequent face on local news talking about bringing jobs and prosperity to rural communities. Kendrick Samuel said the name, tasting bitter in his mouth. Kendrick Energy has been drilling under our land. Without permission, Marcus added, his voice rising with anger. Without payment. Without environmental assessment. This is theft, Sam. This is corporate theft on a massive scale. A sound echoed from deeper in the tunnel, a metallic clang, like a door closing. Both men froze their flashlights, immediately pointing toward the source of the noise. Someone's down here, Samuel whispered, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver on his belt. Another sound, footsteps this time, multiple sets growing closer, and voices too distant to make out words but definitely human. We need to go, Marcus said urgently. Now. But Samuel was grabbing papers from the desk, stuffing them into his jacket. Maps, documents, anything with the Kendrick logo. Evidence. Sam, we need to leave. The footsteps were getting closer. Flashlight beams bounced off the tunnel walls ahead, coming from one of the side passages. They ran. Two middle-aged farmers sprinting through an underground tunnel they shouldn't have known existed, their boots slapping against concrete, their breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the walls. Behind them, shouts now clear and angry. Stop. This is private property. Private property. The irony would have been laughable if they weren't running for their lives. This was Samuel's property, had been his family's for over a century, and yet here were strangers claiming ownership of tunnels built in secret beneath it. They reached the main tunnel entrance just as their pursuers rounded the last corner. Samuel caught a glimpse of them, men in hard hats and work clothes, but also men in suits, and at least one uniform that looked security or military. Up go! Samuel shouted, practically shoving Marcus toward the rope. Marcus climbed with a speed born of adrenaline, his bulk no hindrance now, as fear propelled him upward. Samuel was right behind him, the rope burning his palms even through the gloves, his muscles screaming as he pulled himself up, hand over hand. Stop, or we'll shoot, came a voice from below. Samuel didn't stop. A gunshot rang out, the bullet striking the earthen wall of the crevice just feet from where Samuel climbed. Dirt and rock showered down, and for a terrifying moment Samuel thought the whole wall might collapse. But it held, and he kept climbing. Another shot, this one going wide. They were warning shots, Samuel realized. They didn't want to kill him. Dead men tell no tales, but they also bring investigations. They wanted to scare him off, make him go away quietly. They didn't know Samuel Hale very well. He hauled himself over the edge of the crevice just as Marcus was starting the truck. Samuel threw himself into the passenger seat, and Marcus gunned at the truck's tires, spinning in the dirt, before finding purchase and launching them toward the farmhouse. We need to call the police. Marcus said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The FBI. Someone. The phones are down, Samuel reminded him. But then he pulled out his cell phone. 1 bar. Barely any signal, but maybe enough. He dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was crackly but audible. This is Samuel Hale out on County Road 47. There's been an earthquake and we've discovered illegal tunnels under my property, Kendrick Energy. There are men with guns. The line went dead. Not drop dead. Samuel looked at his phone. No signal at all, now not even the single bar. They're jamming the cell towers, Marcus said, a note of disbelief in his voice. Jesus Christ, Sam, how big is this? Before Samuel could answer, they heard vehicles approaching fast on the main road. Multiple vehicles from the sound of the engines. Marcus turned sharply, taking them not toward the farmhouse but toward the back 40, where old tractor paths wound through stands of trees. We need to get to town, Samuel said. To the sheriff's office. To somewhere public where they can't just make us disappear. Disappear? Marcus looked at his friend with alarm. Sam, you don't think... I don't know what to think, Samuel interrupted, but they were shooting at us, Marcus. And these tunnels, this operation, it's worth millions, maybe billions. People have killed for a lot less. They drove in tense silence through the back roads both men knew like the lines on their own hands. Every turn, every hidden path between fields, every shortcut their grandfathers had shown them, this was their territory, their advantage. The vehicles behind them fell away, unable to follow through terrain they didn't know. But as they approached the outskirts of Cedar Rapids, the small town that served as the county seat, Marcus slowed the truck. Sam, he said quietly, look. Ahead at the intersection, where the back road met Main Street, 2 black SUVs were parked. Men in suits stood beside them, clearly watching for Marcus's distinctive red truck. Back up, Samuel said, quietly. Marcus put the truck in reverse, easing back until they were hidden by a stand of cottonwood trees. They sat there for a moment, engine idling, both men coming to terms with the reality of their situation. They're not going to let us just report this, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. No, Samuel agreed. They're not. So what do we do? Samuel pulled out the papers he'd grabbed from the tunnel, spreading them on the dashboard. Maps, inspection reports, shipping manifests, all bearing the Kendrick Energy logo, all proof of the massive operation beneath their feet. We need help, he said. Someone they can't buy or intimidate. Someone who can make this public before they bury it. Who, the governor, the newspapers? Samuel thought of his daughter, Emily, at the state university. She had professors there, connections to environmental groups, access to social media platforms that could spread information faster than Kendrick could suppress it. I need to get to Lincoln, he said. To Emily. Marcus nodded. I'll drive you. But Sam, my farm. Helen. Go home, Samuel said. Take Helen and get out of town for a few days. Visit your sister in Kansas City. Don't tell anyone where you're going. And you. Samuel looked at the papers in his hands, then at the crevice still visible in the distance on his land, the wound that had revealed decades of deception. I'm going to finish what the earthquake started, he said. I'm going to bring this whole thing into the light. Marcus dropped Samuel at his farmhouse, both men knowing it might be the last time they saw each other for a while, possibly forever if things went wrong. They didn't say goodbye. Farmers weren't much for emotional farewells, but Marcus gripped Samuel's shoulder tightly before driving away. Samuel moved quickly through his house, gathering essentials. Cash from the safe, his laptop, phone chargers, changes of clothes. He paused at the mantel, looking at the family photos arranged there. 4 generations of Hales on this land, and someone had been stealing from them all along. He took one photo, him, Margaret, and Emily, at Emily's high school graduation, all 3 of them smiling in the spring sunshine. A reminder of what he was fighting for. His truck, the old blue Ford that had served him faithfully for 15 years, started on the first try. Samuel allowed himself a small smile at that. Detroit might let you down in a lot of ways, but not when you needed it most. As he drove away from the farm, Samuel saw them in his rearview mirror, the black SUVs turning into his driveway. Men in suits getting out, heading for his house. They'd find it empty, of course. They'd probably trash it, looking for the evidence he carried, but they wouldn't find him. The drive to Lincoln took 3 hours on back roads, avoiding the interstate where they'd surely be watching for him. Samuel's mind raced as he drove, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The oil company's community investments. Over the years, the new hospital wing, the high school football stadium, the sheriff's re-election campaign. They'd been buying silence and compliance, creating a network of obligation and dependence. How many people knew, or at least suspected? How many had been paid off, threatened, or simply chosen to look the other way? The university campus was bustling with late afternoon activity when Samuel arrived. Students walked between classes, absorbed in their phones or conversations, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding in their state's rural heartland. Samuel found Emily in her laboratory at the Agricultural Sciences building, bent over a microscope, her dark hair pulled back in the same messy bun her mother used to wear when concentrating. "Dad?" She looked up in surprise, then alarm, as she took in his appearance, dirty, disheveled, with an urgency in his eyes she'd never seen before. "What's wrong? What are you doing here?" "Emily, I need your help. All of it, right now." He told her everything as quickly and clearly as he could. The earthquake, the tunnel, Kendrick Energy, the shots fired, the cover-up already in motion. With each word, Emily's eyes grew wider, her expression shifting from disbelief to anger to determination. "Those bastards," she said when he finished the profanity, surprising him she'd inherited her mother's usual reserve with such language. "They've been poisoning our land for decades." "You believe me?" "Dad, I've been studying soil samples from our farm for my thesis. The contamination levels never made sense for agricultural runoff alone. There were petroleum traces, heavy metals, chemicals that shouldn't be there." She pulled up files on her computer showing him graphs and charts he didn't fully understand but recognized as proof. "I thought maybe it was from old equipment or illegal dumping, but this explains everything." She was already in motion, calling her advisor, sending emails to environmental groups she worked with, uploading Samuel's photos and documents to secure cloud servers. Her generation's relationship with technology was something Samuel had never fully understood, but now he was grateful for it. Within minutes, she had created an information network that Kendrick Energy, for all its power, couldn't entirely shut down. "We need more," she said, fingers flying over her keyboard. "The documents are good, but we need video, testimony, something that will go viral that news outlets can't ignore." "I can go back," Samuel said. "Record everything." "No." Emily's response was immediate and firm. "Dad, they're probably watching the farm. It's too dangerous. It's my land, Emily. My responsibility." She looked at him then, with eyes that reminded him painfully of Margaret, that same mixture of love and exasperation her mother had perfected over their 28 years of marriage. "It's our land," she corrected. "Our fight, and we're going to be smart about it." Her phone rang. Dr. Patricia Wheeler, her thesis advisor and one of the university's most respected environmental scientists. Emily put her on speaker. "Emily, I've seen the documents you sent. This is enormous and dangerous. Where's your father now?" "He's here with me," Emily answered. "Good. Keep him there. I'm calling Channel 7 News. I have a contact there who won't let this get buried. But Mr. Hale, you need to understand something. Kendrick Energy has resources you can't imagine. Lawyers, politicians, media influence. Once this goes public, they'll come at you with everything they have." "Oh, let them come," Samuel said, surprising himself with the steel in his voice. "They've been stealing from my family for generations. It ends now." Dr. Wheeler was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll be there in 20 minutes with my team. We're going to document everything, create a record they can't destroy or deny. Emily, call your friend at the EPA, the one who interned with you last summer. We need federal involvement before Kendrick can lock this down at the state level." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. The small laboratory became a command center with students and professors arriving as word spread through the academic community. Environmental lawyers appeared offering pro bono representation. Journalists started calling, having heard rumors of a major story brewing. But it was the arrival of Dr. Caleb Boyd that changed everything. "Uncle Marcus called me," she said as she entered the lab. And Samuel saw the family resemblance immediately, the same strong jaw, the same determined eyes. though Kayla's were behind stylish glasses that gave her an air of scholarly authority. He told me what you found. I'm a petroleum geologist, Mr. Hale. I've worked in the industry for 10 years before getting disgusted with it and going into environmental remediation. What you've discovered, I can help you understand it. She examined the documents with an expert eye, her expression growing more grim with each page. This isn't just oil extraction, she said finally. These chemical signatures, the pipeline configurations they're doing, underground fracking, hydraulic fracturing right beneath inhabited land. That's why your water table dropped, why the soil's contaminated. They've been breaking apart the bedrock under your feet for years. Is that legal? Emily asked. Not without permits, not without environmental impact studies, and definitely not without landowner permission. Kayla looked at Samuel. This is criminal. Federal crime criminal. EPA violation criminal. We're talking about executives going to prison if this is proven. Then we prove it, Samuel said simply. The call came at sunset. Samuel's phone, which had been silent all day, suddenly rang with a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Hale. The voice was smooth-cultured with just a hint of threat beneath the polish. This is William Kendrick, Jr. I believe we need to talk. I have nothing to say to you, Samuel began, but Kendrick continued as if he hadn't spoken. I understand there was an unfortunate incident on your property today. An earthquake act of God, really, revealed some old mining tunnels from the early 1900s. Dangerous things, those old tunnels. Unstable. We'd be happy to help seal them up for you, ensure your safety. And of course, we'd compensate you for any inconvenience. They're not old mining tunnels, Samuel said flatly. They're your tunnels. Your illegal operation. There was a pause, then Kendrick's voice returned harder now. Mr. Hale, you're a smart man, a family man. Your daughter Emily is doing remarkable work at the university. It would be a shame if her research funding were to dry up, if her advisor were to suddenly find irregularities in her work. Academic careers are so fragile, aren't they? Are you threatening my daughter? I'm offering you an opportunity, Mr. Hale. Take the money, take care of your family, or continue down this path and see where it leads. The choice is yours. Samuel looked around the room at the assembled team, his daughter fierce and brilliant. Dr. Wheeler already on the phone with federal authorities. Kayla Boyd preparing a technical report that would expose decades of environmental crimes. The students and journalists and lawyers who had rallied to their cause in a matter of hours. I've made my choice, Samuel said. I'll see you in court, Mr. Kendrick, or in prison, whichever comes first. He hung up to a room full of approving nods and grim smiles. They all knew what they were risking, what they were up against. But they also knew they were right. As night fell over, Lincoln Emily's first video went live on social media. It showed the crevice, the tunnel, the documents, and Samuel himself calmly and clearly explaining what had been discovered. Within an hour, it had 10,000 views. Within 2 hours, 50,000. By midnight, it was trending nationally. The earthquake that had shaken Samuel's farm that morning had done more than reveal hidden tunnels. It had started a different kind of tremor, one that would shake the foundations of corporate power and rural complicity. It had awakened something in Samuel Hale and his community, a refusal to be victims any longer, a determination to fight for their land and their legacy. But the real battle was just beginning. Kendrick Energy wouldn't go down without a fight, and they had resources that dwarfed anything Samuel and his allies could muster. The tunnels beneath the farmland were just the visible part of a vast network of corruption and exploitation that stretched to the highest levels of business and government. As Samuel finally tried to rest in Emily's small apartment, he thought about the morning's earthquake. Such a random event, a geological hiccup that should have been nothing more than a curious footnote in Nebraska's history. Instead, it had exposed a truth that powerful people had spent decades and millions of dollars keeping hidden. He thought about his grandfather Harold, dismissed as senile when he heard machinery beneath the ground. About his father, who had fought so hard to keep the farm during the agricultural crisis of the 1980s, never knowing that thieves were already stealing from beneath his feet. About Margaret, who had died never knowing why her prized garden had slowly withered despite her best efforts. Tomorrow, the lawyers would come in force. The media would descend. Politicians would make statements. Kendrick Energy would deploy every weapon in their corporate arsenal to destroy Samuel Hale and anyone who stood with him. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of his daughter's apartment, Samuel allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had done what 4 generations of Hales before him would have done. He had stood up for his land, his family, and his community. He had refused to be bought or intimidated. The earthquake had revealed the tunnels, but Samuel Hale would reveal the truth. And sometimes the truth was the most powerful force of all. Outside in the distance, sirens wailed through the night, emergency vehicles, news vans, perhaps even federal agents beginning their investigation. The world was coming to bear witness to what had been hidden beneath Nebraska's soil. And Samuel Hale, farmer father, and now unlikely warrior against corporate corruption, closed his eyes and prepared for the battle of his life. The morning would bring challenges he could barely imagine, but also allies he had never expected. The earth had spoken that morning in the language of earthquakes and revelation. Now it was time for Samuel Hale to speak in the language of justice and determination. The tunnels had been exposed, but the real excavation of truth, of accountability, of justice was just beginning. The first explosion came at 4:47 a.m., 3 days after the video went viral. Samuel jolted awake in Emily's apartment to the sound of his phone buzzing frantically. Marcus was calling, his voice tight with panic, when Samuel answered. "Sam, they blew it up, the whole southern field. The crevice, the tunnel entrance, it's all gone." Samuel was already pulling on his clothes, Emily appearing in her doorway with worried eyes. "What do you mean, gone?" "Fire department's here now. They're calling it a gas leak explosion. But Sam, we both know there's no gas line running through that field. They destroyed the evidence." Samuel felt his stomach drop. Without the physical tunnel as proof, their case became infinitely harder. But Kendrick had made a mistake. Destroying evidence was a federal crime in itself, and the explosion would draw even more attention. "Is anyone hurt?" Samuel asked, dreading the answer. "No, thank God. But Sam, that's not all. There are federal agents at your house. FBI. They showed up about an hour ago." Emily was already at her laptop pulling up news feeds. The explosion was breaking news aerial footage showing Samuel's southern field transformed into a smoking crater. The reporter was dutifully repeating the gas leak story, but Samuel could see the skepticism in her eyes. A knock at the door made them both freeze. Emily looked through the peephole, then back at her father with relief. "It's Dr. Wheeler and someone else." Patricia Wheeler entered with a woman in a severe black suit who radiated federal authority. "Mr. Hale, this is Special Agent Diana Chen from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. She needs to speak with you." Agent Chen's handshake was firm, her gaze direct. "Mr. Hale, we've been investigating Kendrick Energy for 18 months. Your discovery has given us the break we've been waiting for." "You knew," Samuel couldn't keep the anger from his voice. "You knew what they were doing." "We suspected. Unusual financial patterns, shell companies purchasing mineral rights, environmental reports that didn't add up. But we had no physical evidence until your video." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The explosion at your farm this morning wasn't meant to destroy evidence, Mr. Hale. It was meant to destroy you. Our surveillance team reports you were supposed to be there." Emily gasped, reaching for her father's hand. Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. "How did they know I'd go back?" "Because that's what you've done every morning for 30 years, Chen said simply. "They studied you, Mr. Hale. Your routines, your habits. The only reason you're alive is because you broke pattern by staying here." The weight of it settled on Samuel's shoulders. They'd tried to kill him. These weren't just corporate criminals anymore. They were would-be murderers. "We need to move you both to protective custody," Chen continued. "Kendrick's getting desperate. Desperate men do desperate things." "No," Samuel said firmly. "I'm not hiding. That's what they want, for me to disappear, to go quiet. We have a press conference scheduled for this afternoon." Chen looked like she wanted to argue, but Emily spoke first. "He's right. If we hide now, Kendrick controls the narrative. They'll spin this as an accident, pay off the right people, and it'll all get buried. We need to stay visible." The agent studied them both, then nodded slowly. "Fine. But we do this my way. You'll have federal protection, and you don't go anywhere without my team." The press conference was held at the university, the auditorium packed with reporters from across the country. Samuel had never been comfortable with public speaking. Margaret had always been the one to handle school board meetings and church presentations. But as he stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of cameras and expectant faces, he found his voice. "My name is Samuel Hale," he began, his weathered hands gripping the podium. "My family has farmed the same piece of Nebraska land for over a century. 3 days ago, an earthquake revealed that Kendrick Energy Corporation has been stealing from us for decades." He told the story simply without embellishment. The tunnel, the documents, the threats, the explosion. Emily presented her soil analysis data showing contamination levels that should have triggered EPA intervention years ago. Kayla Boyd explained the technical aspects of illegal fracking, making complex geology accessible to the average viewer. But it was Marcus who stole the show. He hadn't planned to speak, had only come to support his friend. But when a reporter asked about the impact on local farmers, Marcus stood up in the audience, his big frame unmistakable. "You want to know the impact?" he said, his voice carrying across the auditorium. "My wife Helen has stage 3 cancer, lymphoma. The doctors said it was just bad luck, genetics maybe. But our well water, the water we've been drinking for 20 years, it's been poisoned, contaminated by whatever Kendrick's been pumping into the ground." The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions, cameras swung toward Marcus, but he wasn't finished. "How many others?" he continued, tears now streaming down his weathered face. "How many of my neighbors got sick and never knew why? How many kids developed asthma? How many miscarriages did our women suffer? How many of us buried loved ones, not knowing we were being poisoned by our own land?" Samuel moved to his friend's side, supporting him as Marcus's shoulders shook with grief and rage. The image, 2 farmers' brothers in all but blood standing against corporate malfeasance, would be on every front page in America the next morning. William Kendrick, Jr. S. response came within hours. A hastily arranged counter-press conference where he stood before Kendrick Energy's logo flanked by lawyers, his silver hair perfectly styled and his expression one of practiced concern. "The allegations made by Mr. Hale and his associates are completely false," he said smoothly. "Kendrick Energy has always operated within the law. The tunnels discovered on Mr. Hale's property are part of a legacy infrastructure system from the 1950s, predating current ownership and regulations. We were in the process of properly decommissioning these old systems when the earthquake caused structural damage." He produced documents, official-looking papers with impressive seals. "These records clearly show that Kendrick Energy only acquired these assets in 2018 as part of our commitment to environmental remediation. We've been working to clean up the mistakes of the past, not create new ones." It was masterful, Samuel had to admit. In minutes, Kendrick had reframed himself as the environmental hero trying to fix old problems rather than create new ones. Some reporters were already looking skeptical of Samuel's claims, but Emily had anticipated this. That evening, she released the second video. This one featured Harold Hale, Samuel's grandfather, recorded by Emily herself 3 years before his death. In it, the old man, sharp-eyed despite his age, described the sounds he heard at night. "Started in 72 inches, Harold said on the recording, his voice thin but clear. "Right after that Kendrick boy took over his daddy's company. Machinery running all night deep underground. I complained to the sheriff, but he said I was hearing things. But I knew. I could feel it through the ground vibrations in the earth. They were doing something down there." The video included Harold's journals, meticulously kept records dating back 50 years, documenting dates and times when he heard the underground activity. Emily had cross-referenced these with Kendrick Energy's operations records, obtained through a sympathetic whistleblower showing perfect correlation. The coup de grace was a photograph from 1978 Harold, standing next to a young William Kendrick Jr. at a county fair. Kendrick's hand on Harold's shoulder, both men smiling. The caption in Harold's careful handwriting, "Billy Kendrick promised to look into the night sounds. He lied." The whistleblower themselves came forward the next day. Janet Morrison, a 60-year-old accountant who'd worked for Kendrick Energy for 35 years, walked into the FBI field office with boxes of documents she'd been secretly copying for decades. "I knew it was wrong," she told Agent Chen as Samuel and Emily watched from behind one-way glass. "But I had kids to feed, bills to pay. They paid well, and they made it clear what would happen if anyone talked. But when I saw that boy Marcus crying about his wife, I've known Helen Boyd since high school. I can't stay quiet anymore." The documents Janet provided were damning, detailed records of illegal drilling operations, bribes paid to local officials, environmental reports falsified or destroyed, and most cruised a paper trail showing that William Kendrick Jr. had personally signed off on operations under the Hale farm as recently as last month. "This is it," Chen said, barely containing her excitement. "This gives us everything we need for federal prosecution. RICO charges environmental crimes, conspiracy, attempted murder. Kendrick's going to prison for the rest of his life." But Kendrick Energy wasn't going down without a fight. The lawsuit started arriving the next day. Defamation suits against Samuel Emily Marcus, the university, and every news outlet that had covered the story. Cease and desist orders. Injunctions. Kendrick's legal team was attempting to bury them in paper, drain their resources, and silence their voices. "It's intimidation tactics," the pro bono lawyer explained to Samuel. "They know these suits won't hold up in court, but they're hoping to exhaust you, bankrupt you, make you give up." "Then they don't know farmers very well," Samuel replied. "We're used to long fights. Weather pests, market prices. We fight something every season. This is just another type of storm to weather." The support that poured in was overwhelming. Environmental groups provided additional lawyers. A GoFundMe page for Samuel's legal defense raised $200,000 in 48 hours. Farmers from across the Midwest began sharing their own stories of unexplained soil contamination and mysterious illnesses. But it was the discovery made by Dr. Wheeler's research team that changed everything. "Mr. Hale," she said, calling him late one evening, her voice shaking with excitement and horror. "We've been analyzing the chemical signatures in your soil samples. The contamination isn't just from oil extraction. They've been disposing of industrial waste. Benzene, toluene, heavy metals. Your land has been used as an illegal toxic waste dump." Samuel sat down hard, the phone trembling in his hand. "For how long?" "Based on the soil stratification, at least 40 years, maybe longer. His land, his family's legacy, poisoned for decades while they worked. It lived on, it raised their children on it. Margaret's garden hadn't failed because of her care, it had been poisoned from below." The rage that filled Samuel was unlike anything he'd ever felt. Not hot anger, but something cold and implacable. They hadn't just stolen from him, they'd poisoned his wife, his land, his entire life. "Document everything," he told Dr. Wheeler. "Every chemical, every concentration level, every single violation. We're going to bury them with their own poison." The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Tom Phillips, a Kendrick Energy security guard who'd been one of the men in the tunnel that first day, contacted Emily through a burner phone. "I can't live with this anymore," he said, when they met in a parking garage, Agent Chen's team providing security. "What they made us do, it wasn't right. I've got kids. I don't want them growing up in a world where companies can do this." Tom had recordings, audio files from security meetings where Kendrick executives discussed the illegal operations, laughed about fooling the stupid farmers, and planned the cover-up. Most damning was a recording from the morning of the explosion. William Kendrick Jr., S. voice clear and unmistakable. "Make sure Hale is there when it goes. We can't have him testifying. Make it look like he was investigating on his own tragic accident. Farmer got too curious about unstable ground." Agent Chen listened to the recording 3 times, her expression growing more grim with each playback. "This is conspiracy to commit murder. Recorded. Undeniable." She looked at Samuel. "You realize what this means? This isn't just corporate crime anymore. This is attempted murder of a federal witness. Kendrick's looking at life without parole." The arrest began at dawn a week later. FBI agents swept through Kendrick Energy's headquarters, regional offices, and the homes of executives. William Kendrick Jr. was arrested at his estate, photographers capturing the image of the once powerful CEO in handcuffs being led to a federal vehicle. Samuel watched the coverage from his farm, standing in the crater where his southern field used to be. Emily stood beside him, her arm linked through his. "We did it, Dad," she said softly. "No," Samuel corrected, looking out over his wounded land. "We started it. This isn't over." He was right. The investigation would reveal that Kendrick Energy was just one company in a vast network of illegal drilling and waste disposal operations across the Midwest. The tunnels under Samuel's farm connected to systems in 3 states, all built without permission, all contaminating groundwater and soil that fed millions of Americans. The congressional hearings that followed put Samuel in the national spotlight. He testified for 3 hours, his simple eloquence and obvious integrity making him a folk hero to many Americans who saw their own struggles against corporate power reflected in his story. My grandfather heard the machines in 1,972 inches, Samuel told the assembled senators. He tried to tell people, but nobody listened because he was just an old farmer. How many other voices have been ignored? How many other crimes hidden because the victims were just ordinary people trying to live their lives? Marcus testified too, Helen beside him, despite her chemotherapy treatments leaving her weak. Their testimony about the health impacts led to the creation of a federal fund for medical treatment for all affected residents paid for by Kendrick Energy's seized assets. But for Samuel, the real victory came 6 months later. The restoration project had been Emily's idea. Using Kendrick Energy's settlement money and additional federal environmental cleanup funds, they would not just clean the contaminated soil, but transform it into something better. "We'll make it a teaching farm," Emily explained to the gathered crowd on a bright October morning. "Solar panels where the tunnel entrances were, greenhouse systems for year-round growing, demonstration plots showing how to remediate contaminated soil. We'll turn their crime scene into a classroom." The southern field, once split by the crevice that revealed Kendrick's crimes, had been carefully excavated and cleaned. The tunnels had been mapped, studied, and then filled with concrete sealed forever. Above them, new soil had been laid rich and clean and full of promise. Samuel planted the first seed himself, corn, because that's what Hale's had always grown. As he pressed it into the earth, he thought about his grandfather Harold, who'd known something was wrong but couldn't prove it. About his father, who'd fought to keep the farm never knowing it was being stolen from below. About Margaret, who'd loved this land as much as he did. "This is for you," he whispered to all of them, his hands deep in the clean soil. The farm would never be quite the same. The scars were too deep, the contamination too extensive in some areas. But it would heal slowly, carefully, under the watchful eyes of scientists and farmers working together. William Kendrick Jr. was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. 12 other executives received sentences ranging from 5 to 30 years. Kendrick Energy was dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay for cleanup efforts across 3 states. New regulations were passed requiring regular deep soil and water testing near any industrial operations. The Hale farm became a symbol of resistance of ordinary people standing up to extraordinary power. Tourists came to see the memorial Emily had erected at the site of the original crevice, a simple stone marker that read, "Here the earth spoke truth to power." But for Samuel, the most important moment came on a quiet evening a year after the earthquake. He was sitting on his porch watching the sun set over fields that were slowly coming back to life. Emily was inside working on her laptop, having decided to stay and help run the teaching farm after completing her doctorate. Marcus and Helen were coming for dinner, Helen's cancer in remission thanks to proper treatment. The phone rang. It was a farmer from Iowa, an old man whose voice reminded Samuel of his grandfather. "Mr. Hale, I've been hearing sounds under my land, just like you described. Machinery at night. Nobody believes me, but I know what I hear. Can you help?" Samuel stood up, looking out at his land, wounded, but healing, scarred, but still his. "Yes," he said simply, "I can help. Tell me everything." Because that was the real victory, not just exposing Kendrick Energy, not just the prosecutions and settlements and regulations. It was that now when someone heard something wrong, felt something wrong, knew something wrong, they would be heard. They would be believed. They would be helped. The earthquake that had shaken Samuel's farm that March morning had done more than expose tunnels. It had created a network of its own farmers, scientists, lawyers, and ordinary citizens connected by a determination to protect their land and their communities from those who would exploit them. As Samuel listened to the farmer from Iowa describe the sounds beneath his fields, he pulled out a notebook and began writing down details. Tomorrow he would call Agent Chen, Dr. Wheeler Emily, and all the others who had become his allies in this fight. They would investigate, document, and if necessary, expose another corporate crime. The earth had spoken that day in March, revealing secrets long buried. But Samuel Hale had ensured that its voice would not be silenced again. The tremor that had started on his small Nebraska farm had become an earthquake of justice that continued to shake boardrooms and government offices across the country. Some fights, Samuel had learned, were worth everything. And sometimes when you stood up to power, when you refused to be silenced or bought or intimidated, you discovered that you weren't standing alone. You were standing with everyone who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or exploited. And together, that was a force more powerful than any corporation, any amount of money, any threat. The sun disappeared below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Samuel of the dawn when this had all began. But this wasn't an ending. It was a transformation. The Hale farm, like the truth itself, had been wounded but not destroyed. And from that wound had come healing, justice, and hope. Samuel closed his notebook and walked inside to join his daughter, ready to begin planning the next battle in a war that would likely continue for years. But he was no longer afraid. The earth had taught him to listen, and he had taught others to speak. And in that exchange, in that simple act of bearing witness and demanding justice, everything had changed. The phone rang again. Another farmer, another story, another piece of the vast puzzle of corporate crime and rural exploitation. Samuel answered it as he would answer every call that came for as long as he was able. Because that's what Harold Hale would have done, what 4 generations of Hales had done, stood their ground, protected their land, and fought for what was right. The earthquake had ended, but the aftershocks would continue for generations. And Samuel Hale would be there for every one of them, a farmer who had looked into the darkness beneath his feet and chosen to bring it into the light. The Iowa farmer's call was just the beginning. Within days of the news coverage showing Samuel helping expose a second illegal drilling operation, his phone hadn't stopped ringing. Farmers from Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, all reporting similar stories. Strange sounds at night, unexplained soil contamination wells going dry without reason. What had started as one man's fight for his land was becoming a movement that stretched across the heartland. Emily had set up a makeshift command center in the old barn, transforming the space where Samuel had once milked cows into something resembling a detective's office. Maps covered the walls marked with red pins for confirmed illegal operations, yellow for suspected sites, green for areas already under investigation. The pattern that emerged was staggering, a web of underground exploitation that followed geological formations rich in shale oil and natural gas. "Dad, look at this," Emily said one morning 3 weeks after the Iowa discovery. She was comparing satellite images on her laptop, her coffee long gone cold. These companies, they're all connected. Shell corporations owned by shell corporations, but if you follow the money far enough back... She pulled up a corporate structure chart that looked like a spider's web. At the center wasn't Kendrick Energy, but a name Samuel had never heard before: Titan Resources International. Kendrick was just a subsidiary, Emily continued, her voice tight with anger. A single tentacle of something much bigger. Titan Resources owns 14 different energy companies across 6 states. They've been doing this everywhere, Dad. Everywhere. Agent Chen arrived that afternoon with a team of federal investigators. The FBI had been following the same trail, she explained, but Emily's grassroots network of farmers and environmental scientists had uncovered connections the federal government had missed. "We need your help, Mr. Hale," Chen said, spreading files across the kitchen table where Margaret had once served Sunday dinners. "You've become something we didn't expect, a symbol people trust. Farmers who wouldn't talk to federal agents will talk to you." Samuel looked at the files, each one representing a family like his land, like his poisoned and stolen from without their knowledge. "What are you asking me to do?" "Go on the road, visit these farms, document what you find. We'll provide protection and resources, but we need someone these people trust to get them to come forward." It was Marcus who convinced him, showing up that evening with Helen and a casserole that reminded Samuel painfully of Margaret's cooking. "You remember what my daddy used to say?" Marcus asked, settling his bulk into the chair he'd occupied countless times over the decades. "He said evil grows in the dark, but it dies in the light. You've got a flashlight now, Sam. Maybe the biggest flashlight any farmer's ever held. Question is, what are you going to do with it?" Helen, thin from her cancer treatments, but with fire in her eyes, reached across the table to take Samuel's hand. "Margaret would want you to do this," she said simply. "She always said you were too stubborn to know when you were beat. Maybe that stubbornness is exactly what's needed now." Samuel looked at his friends, at his daughter, at the federal agent who'd become an unlikely ally. The farm needed him here, needed his hands working the soil, tending to the daily rhythms of rural life. But other farms needed him more, needed what he'd learned, what he'd survived. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this right. Full documentation, complete transparency. And Emily comes with me. She understands the science better than I ever will." The first stop was Kansas, a wheat farm outside Topeka, where the Brennan family had been fighting bankruptcy for 3 years, unable to understand why their yields had dropped so dramatically. Samuel and Emily arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, Agent Chen's team maintaining a discreet distance while providing security. Tom Brennan was a man who looked older than his 45 years, his face lined with worry and sleepless nights. His wife Sarah stood beside him, their 3 teenage children watching from the porch, with expressions that mixed hope and skepticism. "Started about 5 years ago," Tom explained as he led them across his fields. The wheat should have been green and thriving this time of year, but instead it was patchy and yellowed, struggling to grow. "First we thought it was drought, then disease had every expert out here. Nobody could explain it. We're about to lose everything, 4 generations of farming gone." Emily was already taking soil samples, her movements efficient and practiced. Samuel knelt beside her, running the dirt through his fingers. It felt wrong somehow, less alive than soil should be lacking that rich earthiness that healthy land possessed. "Mr. Brennan," Samuel said, standing and brushing his hands on his jeans, "have you ever heard sounds at night, machinery drilling, anything unusual?" Tom and Sarah exchanged glances. "Our youngest, Amy, she complained about it last summer, said she could hear humming through her bedroom floor. We thought it was just the air conditioner acting up." Amy Brennan, 16, with her mother's red hair and her father's determined jaw, stepped forward. "It wasn't the AC," she said firmly. "It was rhythmic, like a heartbeat. 3 in the morning, every morning, for about 2 hours. I recorded it on my phone." The recording was faint but unmistakable, the same deep thrumming Samuel had heard in his own tunnels. Emily's equipment confirmed what they suspected: benzene levels in the soil that were 30 times safe limits, along with a cocktail of other industrial chemicals. But it was what they found that evening that truly shocked everyone. Following Amy's directions to where the sound was strongest, they discovered not just evidence of drilling, but an active operation. Hidden beneath an abandoned grain silo on the edge of the Brennan property was an entrance concealed by overgrowth and a rusted metal door marked with warnings about structural danger. Agent Chen's team moved in, but the operators had been warned somehow. By the time they breached the entrance, the tunnels below were empty, though still warm from recent activity. The equipment left behind, however, told its own story. Drilling apparatus with Titan resources, serial numbers, chemical tanks still half full of fracking fluid, and computers that the FBI's tech team fell upon like hungry wolves. "They were still operating," Chen said, disbelief coloring her voice. "Even after all the arrests, the congressional hearings, they were still drilling." The Brennan family stood in their violated field, tears streaming down Sarah's face as she realized the magnitude of what had been done to them. Tom held his wife, his own eyes wet, while their children stood in shocked silence. "We're going to fight this," Samuel told them, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd already won this battle once. "We're going to get your land cleaned, get you compensated, and make sure whoever did this pays for it." "How?" Tom asked, his voice broken. "We're nobody. We're just farmers." "So was I," Samuel replied. "But I learned something important. We're only nobody if we stay quiet. When we speak up, when we stand together, we become everybody. And everybody is impossible to ignore." The pattern repeated across the Midwest. In Missouri, they found tunnels beneath a dairy farm where half the herd had developed mysterious illnesses. In Oklahoma, an entire town's water supply had been contaminated by illegal waste disposal in underground caverns. Each discovery brought more media attention, more public outrage, and more farmers willing to come forward with their own stories. But it was in Arkansas where things turned deadly. Samuel and Emily had just finished documenting contamination at a rice farm when their hotel room door exploded inward at 3 in the morning. Men in black masks stormed in, and Samuel barely had time to push Emily behind the bed before the shooting started. Agent Chen's security detail responded immediately, but the attackers had come prepared. The gunfight lasted less than 2 minutes, but felt like hours, Samuel shielding Emily with his body while bullets shattered the windows and riddled the walls above them. When it was over, 2 FBI agents were wounded and 1 attacker was dead. The others had fled, leaving behind professional-grade weapons and equipment that suggested military training. This wasn't Titan resources, Chen said later after Emily and Samuel had been moved to a safe house. This was something else. Someone doesn't want this investigation to continue. The dead attacker was identified as a former Navy SEAL who'd been working for a private military contractor called Blackstone Security, the same company Emily discovered through her network of investigative journalists that provided security for multiple energy companies, defense contractors, and foreign governments. "We're not just fighting corporate criminals anymore," Emily said, her hand still shaking from the attack. "We're fighting something bigger, Dad, something with ties to military and government." Samuel held his daughter, feeling her tremble against him. For the first time since this began, he questioned whether he was doing the right thing. Exposing Kendrick Energy had been about justice for his land. This was becoming something else, a war against forces that wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect their interests. But the next morning brought unexpected allies. Senator Patricia Harrison, chair of the Senate Environmental Committee, arrived at the safe house with a contingent of Capitol Police and federal marshals. "Mr. Hale," she said, her silver hair and sharp suit making her look like the Washington power player she was. "What you've uncovered goes all the way to the top. There are people in our government and our military who've been profiting from this exploitation. They're going to try to stop you, discredit you, maybe even kill you. But I'm here to tell you that you're not alone." She produced documents, classified files that had been leaked to her office by a whistleblower inside the Department of Energy. They showed a systematic collaboration between certain government officials and energy companies to exploit mineral rights beneath private land using national security as a cover for what amounted to theft. "This is treason," the senator said bluntly. "Selling out American citizens for profit. And you, Mr. Hale, you and your daughter have exposed it. Now we need to finish what you started." The congressional hearing that followed was unlike anything the country had seen since Watergate. Samuel testified for 2 days, presenting evidence of not just environmental crimes, but a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. Emily's scientific data was devastating, showing contamination levels that would take generations to clean up. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. William Kendrick Jr., speaking via video link from federal prison, had decided to cooperate fully with investigators. "I was a small player," he said, his once powerful voice now hollow with defeat. "Titan Resources, Blackstone Security, certain individuals in the Department of Energy and Defense. They run an operation that makes my crimes look like shoplifting. They've been using America's farmland as their personal resource extraction and waste disposal system for 50 years. He named names. Assistant secretaries, military procurement officers, CEOs of companies everyone had heard of. Each name was another domino falling, another piece of the conspiracy exposed. The attack on the investigation came swift and hard. Suddenly, Samuel found himself accused of falsifying evidence. A doctored video surfaced, supposedly showing him planting contaminated soil samples. Former employees of Kendrick Energy, clearly paid off, testified that Samuel had been trying to extort money from the company for years. Major news outlets owned by corporations with ties to Titan Resources began running stories questioning Samuel's mental stability, his financial situation, even suggesting inappropriate relationships with federal investigators. It was character assassination on a massive scale. "They're trying to destroy you," Agent Chen warned during one particularly difficult meeting. "Make you so toxic that nobody will believe your evidence." But they had underestimated the power of community. The farmer Samuel had helped the families whose land had been cleaned because of his efforts. They fought back. A social media campaign with the hashtag #IStand with Samuel went viral. Local news stations, not owned by major corporations, kept covering the real story. Environmental groups, indigenous rights organizations, and agricultural associations formed a coalition that no amount of corporate money could silence. Marcus organized a gathering that he called The Stand. On a clear Saturday morning, over 10,000 farmers and their supporters converged on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. They came in pickup trucks and chartered buses, wearing work clothes and carrying handmade signs. They brought soil samples from their poisoned land in mason jars, creating a display that stretched for a quarter-mile America's farmland contaminated and betrayed. Samuel stood before the Lincoln Memorial, looking out at the sea of faces, weathered, determined, angry, hopeful. These were his people, the backbone of America, the ones who fed the nation and asked for nothing but the right to work their land in peace. "They thought we were invisible," he said, his voice carrying across the mall through speakers that supporters had donated. "They thought because we were scattered across rural America, separated by miles of farmland, that we couldn't unite. They thought because we were just farmers, we didn't matter." The crowd roared its disagreement. "But they forgot something important," Samuel continued. "They forgot that every revolution in history started with people who worked the land. They forgot that we're patient, we're stubborn, and we know how to weather storms. This storm has been building for 50 years, poisoning our soil, stealing our resources, killing our loved ones. Today, we say no more." The speech went viral within hours. More importantly, it reached the right people. Senators who'd been on the fence about supporting comprehensive investigation now faced pressure from constituents. The Attorney General, who'd been dragging his feet on prosecutions, suddenly found the political will to act. The raids happened simultaneously across 12 states. FBI, EPA, and ATF agents arrested 47 individuals, including 3 assistant secretaries, 12 CEOs, and numerous middle management figures who'd facilitated the conspiracy. Titan Resources headquarters was seized, its computers and documents providing a roadmap of criminal activity that sprawled across decades and continents. But for Samuel, the real victory came in smaller moments. Tom Brennan called to say his fields were being cleaned, the contaminated soil removed and replaced at Titan's expense. The Missouri dairy farmer reported that his surviving cows were finally healthy, producing clean milk for the first time in years. The Arkansas rice farmer had received a settlement that would not only save his farm, but allow him to expand, creating jobs in his struggling rural community. Emily had evolved too, transforming from a graduate student into a nationally recognized environmental advocate. She'd been offered positions at prestigious universities, think tanks, and environmental organizations. But she chose to stay in Nebraska, expanding the teaching farm into a research center that would train the next generation of environmental scientists and sustainable farmers. One evening, 6 months after the Arkansas attack, Samuel sat on his porch with Emily watching the sunset over fields that were finally truly clean. The memorial marker at the site of the original crevice had become something of a shrine, with visitors leaving flowers, photos, and notes of gratitude. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" Emily asked, voicing the question that had haunted them both. Samuel thought about Margaret, about her quiet strength, her love for the land, her fierce protection of family. "She would have fought harder than both of us combined," he said. "But yes, I think she'd be proud. We didn't just save our farm, Em. We saved hundreds of farms, thousands maybe." "But there's still more work to do," Emily said, ever the scientist, ever the activist. "Other states, other countries. This system of exploitation didn't just exist here." Samuel nodded. At 63, he was tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. The fight had aged him, marked him, but it had also given him purpose beyond his own land, his own legacy. "Then we keep fighting," he said simply. "That's what farmers do. We plant seeds, we tend them, we protect them from threats, and we keep going until the harvest is complete." A car approached up the long driveway, and Samuel tensed old habits from months of danger. But it was just Marcus and Helen coming for their weekly dinner. Helen was in remission, her cancer caught just in time thanks to the medical screening programs now required for all residents near contaminated sites. As they gathered around the kitchen table, the same table where this journey had begun with Agent Chen spreading out files, Samuel felt a sense of not completion, but transition. The acute phase of the fight was over. Kendrick was in prison. Titan Resources was dismantled, and new regulations were in place that would make such widespread exploitation nearly impossible. But the chronic phase, the long, slow work of healing the land, supporting affected communities, and remaining vigilant against future threats that would continue for the rest of his life. "I got another call today," Samuel mentioned as Helen served a pie that could have been Margaret's recipe. "California this time. Tech company dumping electronic waste in old mines, contaminating groundwater." Marcus groaned. "Don't you ever rest, Sam." Do you rest during planting season? Samuel countered. This is just another kind of planting, sowing justice, cultivating accountability. Emily pulled up information on her laptop, already researching the California situation. The geology's different, but the principle's the same. Corporate exploitation of rural communities who don't have the resources to fight back. Had, Helen corrected firmly, who had no resources. Now they have Samuel Hale. Samuel shook his head. Not just me. They have all of us. Every farmer who stood up, every scientist who documented evidence, every FBI agent who risked their career, every senator who chose justice over campaign contributions. This was never just about me. As the evening wore on, filled with the comfortable conversation of old friends who'd weathered an unprecedented storm together, Samuel found himself thinking about legacy. His grandfather Harold had heard the machines but couldn't prove they existed. His father had fought to keep the farm without knowing it was under attack from below. Samuel had exposed the attack and fought back. But Emily would ensure it never happened again. She and her generation would carry forward the lessons learned, the networks built, the vigilance required to protect the land from those who would exploit it. The phone rang as they were cleaning up dinner. Another farmer, this time from Oregon, reporting strange chemical smells from abandoned logging sites. Samuel listened, took notes, asked the right questions. When he hung up, he found everyone watching him. Well, Marcus asked. Road trip next week, Samuel said. Emily, can you run preliminary soil analysis if they overnight samples? Already on it, she replied, typing rapidly on her laptop. Helen sighed dramatically. I suppose this means you'll miss the church potluck again. Some things are more important than potato salad, Samuel said, then caught himself. Don't tell Pastor Williams I said that. They laughed, the sound filling the kitchen, where so much had been decided, where a simple farmer had chosen to fight rather than submit. Outside, the land stretched dark and quiet under a star-filled sky. The tunnels below were filled with concrete now, the poisons cleaned away, the theft ended. But Samuel knew that somewhere in some boardroom or government office, someone was planning the next exploitation, the next theft, the next assault on rural America. And when they acted, when some farmer heard strange sounds or found mysterious contamination, they would call Samuel Hale. And he would answer as he always did now with a simple promise, we'll help. Because that's what the earthquake had really revealed, not just tunnels and corruption, but the power of ordinary people to stand against extraordinary greed. It had shaken loose decades of deception, but it had also shaken awake a sleeping giant of rural solidarity. As his guests prepared to leave, Samuel walked them to their car, the spring air cool and clean. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fights, new opportunities to protect the land and the people who worked it. But tonight, surrounded by friends and family standing on soil that was finally clean, Samuel Hale allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had listened when the earth spoke. He had refused to be silenced when power threatened. He had stood when standing seemed impossible. And in doing so, he had helped transform American agriculture from an easy target for exploitation into a force for environmental justice. The earthquake that had started everything was now just a memory, its physical effects repaired or removed. But its true impact would ripple through generations, a reminder that sometimes the ground beneath our feet must shake for us to see what's been hidden, and that when it does, we have a choice, look away or look deeper. Samuel Hale had looked deeper. And America's farmland would never be the same. The Oregon investigation would have to wait. 3 days before Samuel and Emily were scheduled to leave, something happened that changed everything. A package arrived at the farm with no return address, just Samuel's name written in shaky handwriting on brown paper. Inside was a single USB drive and a note that read, Mr. Hale, I'm dying. Cancer from the chemicals. This is my confession. Please make them pay. RJ. Emily plugged the drive into her laptop with Agent Chen watching via secure video link. What appeared on screen made them both gasp. It was a video clearly recorded in secret showing a boardroom meeting from 2019. The quality was poor, filmed from what looked like a hidden phone camera, but the audio was clear enough. William Kendrick Jr. was there, but he was clearly subordinate to the man at the head of the table, a figure Samuel recognized from newspaper photos as Alexander Cromwell, CEO of Titan Resources International. But it was the other attendees that made Agent Chen curse under her breath. A deputy secretary of defense, two senators Samuel recognized from the Environmental Committee, and most shocking of all, the current director of the EPA. The Hale situation needs to be contained, Cromwell was saying in the recording. Our projections show another 3 to 4 years of extraction before the geological instability becomes impossible to hide. We need that time. What about the health impacts? One of the senators asked. The cancer rates in these rural counties are becoming noticeable. Cromwell's response was chilling in its casualness. Rural populations have always had higher cancer rates. Pesticides, lifestyle factors, genetic predispositions. There are a dozen explanations we can promote. Dr. Morrison here has prepared several studies that will muddy the waters sufficiently. The camera shifted slightly, revealing a woman Samuel didn't recognize, presumably Doctor Morrison, nodding as she distributed folders around the table. The real concern, Cromwell continued, is someone like Hale. Fourth-generation farmer respected in his community, no financial troubles we can exploit. If someone like him starts asking questions, then we ensure he doesn't, the deputy secretary said flatly. We have resources for that. The video continued for another 20 minutes, detailing a conspiracy so vast that even Samuel, who thought he'd understood the scope of the crime, felt overwhelmed. They weren't just stealing resources, they were conducting what amounted to slow-motion genocide against rural America, sacrificing entire communities for profit while using government power to cover it up. This changes everything, Chen said when the video ended. This is evidence of conspiracy at the highest levels of government. Samuel, this is bigger than Watergate. This is bigger than anything we've ever seen. Emily was already backing up the video to multiple secure servers, her fingers flying across the keyboard. We need to release this immediately. If they know we have it. She was cut off by the sound of vehicles approaching the farm. Not just one or two, but many their engines, creating a rumble that Samuel could feel through the floorboards. He looked out the window to see military vehicles, actual military vehicles, surrounding his house. Chen, are you seeing this? Samuel asked, holding his phone up to the window. Get out! Chen shouted through the video link. Get out now! That's not legitimate military, that's… The connection cut off. The power went out. In the sudden darkness, Samuel grabbed Emily's hand. The storm cellar, he said. Margaret's preserves room. Now! They ran through the house as windows began shattering from smoke grenades being fired inside. The smoke was thick chemical, making their eyes stream and their lungs burn. Samuel felt his way to the kitchen muscle memory, guiding him to the door that led to the old storm cellar Margaret had converted into a storage room for her canning. They tumbled down the wooden steps, Samuel pulling the door shut and throwing the heavy bolt Margaret had insisted on installing after a tornado scare years ago. The cellar was dark, musty, filled with dusty jars of preserves that would never be eaten. But it was also something else. It was where Margaret had made Samuel install an emergency kit after 9/11's, convinced that rural America needed to be prepared for anything. The kit was still there, covered in dust, but intact flashlights, water emergency, radio first aid supplies, and most importantly, an old landline phone that ran on a separate line Margaret had insisted on keeping despite Samuel's protests about the expense. Emily was already dialing Chen's emergency number while Samuel tried the radio. What he heard made his blood run cold. News reports of a terrorist incident at the Hale farm, claims that Samuel and Emily were armed and dangerous, that they'd been manufacturing explosives in the barn. They're framing us, Emily whispered, her face pale in the flashlight's beam. They're going to kill us and say we were terrorists. Above them, boots thundered across the floorboards. Voices shouted commands, though Samuel couldn't make out the words. The sound of furniture being overturned, walls being torn open, the systematic destruction of his home. Then suddenly silence. They waited in the dark, hardly daring to breathe. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then a voice amplified by a megaphone cut through the silence. Mr. Hale, Miss Hale, we know you're still on the property. You have 2 minutes to surrender or we will be forced to use extreme measures. Samuel and Emily looked at each other. They both knew what extreme measures meant. They'd burned the house down, claimed the Hales had set it themselves a murder-suicide by domestic terrorists. But then in the distance, Samuel heard something else, vehicles approaching, many of them, and the distinctive whoop, whoop, whoop of helicopters. The emergency phone rang, making them both jump. Samuel. It was Chen's voice, stressed but determined. "Stay where you are. The real cavalry's coming." What followed was like something out of a movie. FBI agents, federal marshals, and actual military police surrounded the fake military unit. There was shouting confusion, a tense standoff that Samuel and Emily could only listen to from their hiding spot. Then Chen's voice came over a loudspeaker, clear and authoritative. "This is Special Agent Diana Chen of the FBI. The men surrounding this farm are not legitimate military personnel. They are private military contractors engaged in domestic terrorism. Stand down immediately or you will be fired upon." The standoff lasted another 10 minutes before the fake soldiers surrendered. Samuel and Emily emerged from the cellar to find their farm transformed into a crime scene, with federal agents everywhere, the private military contractors in custody, and news helicopters circling overhead like mechanical vultures. Chen met them on the porch, her usually composed face showing genuine relief. "That was too close. If we hadn't traced the video upload and realized what they were planning—" "How did they know?" Emily asked. "How did they know we had the video?" Chen's expression darkened. "Because R.J. Robert Jenkins, the man who sent you the drive, was murdered this morning. They found the packaging materials in his apartment, realized what he'd done." Samuel felt the weight of another death on his conscience. Robert Jenkins, whoever he was, had died trying to expose the truth. How many others had been silenced over the years? The media explosion that followed was unprecedented. The video was released simultaneously to every major news outlet, uploaded to every social media platform, sent to every congressional office. Within hours, it was the only story anyone was talking about. The attempted false flag operation at the Hale farm, captured by news helicopters and FBI body cameras, only added fuel to the fire. Alexander Cromwell was arrested at his estate in Connecticut, caught trying to flee to his private jet. The Deputy Secretary of Defense was taken into custody at the Pentagon. The two senators were arrested on the Senate floor, an image that would become iconic, powerful men in handcuffs being led past the Statue of Justice. But it was the EPA director's arrest that hit Samuel the hardest. The very person supposed to protect America's environment had been actively enabling its destruction. The betrayal was so complete, so fundamental, that it shook faith in institutions across the country. The emergency congressional hearing was held within days, the public demanding immediate action. Samuel testified again, but this time he wasn't alone. Robert Jenkins had been more than just a whistleblower. He'd been Cromwell's personal assistant for 15 years, and the USB drive contained more than just the video. It held 15 years of recordings, documents, emails, a comprehensive record of the conspiracy. Emily presented her analysis of the data showing contamination at over 300 sites across 12 states. The health impacts were staggering. Cancer rates in affected areas were 40% higher than the national average. Birth defects, respiratory diseases, neurological disorders, all traced back to the illegal drilling and waste disposal. But it was the testimony of the victims that truly turned the tide. Farmers, their families, their children, all telling their stories. Marcus brought Helen, who spoke about her cancer with a quiet dignity that had senators wiping their eyes. The Missouri dairy farmer brought photos of his diseased cattle. The Arkansas rice farmer described watching his father die of a cancer the doctors couldn't explain. The legislation that followed was comprehensive and unprecedented. The Rural Protection Act established federal oversight of all underground industrial activity, required quarterly testing of soil and water in agricultural areas, and made corporate executives personally criminally liable for environmental crimes committed by their companies. The cleanup effort was massive, funded by the seized assets of Titan Resources and the other companies involved. It would take decades, scientists estimated, to fully remediate the damage. But it was a start. For Samuel, though, the real change came in smaller ways. His farm became a pilgrimage site of sorts, with people coming from across the country to see where the earthquake had revealed the truth. He didn't particularly enjoy the attention, but Emily convinced him to embrace it. "You're a symbol now, Dad," she explained one evening as they walked through the fields. "People need symbols. They need to know that ordinary people can stand up to power and win." So Samuel began speaking at agricultural colleges, environmental conferences, town halls. He told his story simply, without embellishment, always ending with the same message: listen to your land. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And don't let anyone tell you you're too small to fight back. The teaching farm Emily had envisioned became a reality funded by a combination of government grants and private donations. Young farmers came to learn not just sustainable agriculture, but also how to protect their land from exploitation. Environmental scientists used it as a research station. Legal advocates held workshops on rural rights. One day, about a year after the Cromwell arrest, Samuel was teaching a group of young farmers about soil testing when one of them, a young woman from Montana, raised her hand. "Mr. Hale, weren't you scared? When they came for you, when they tried to kill you." Samuel thought about the question about the fear that had been his constant companion for months. "Terrified," he admitted. "But my wife Margaret used to say something, fear is just your body's way of telling you something important is happening. And this was important, more important than my fear." The young woman nodded, but Samuel could see she had another question. "What kept you going when it seemed impossible?" Samuel looked out over his fields, healed now, but bearing invisible scars like a soldier who'd survived a war. "Anger at first. They'd poisoned my wife, stolen from my family. But anger only takes you so far. What kept me going was love. Love for this land, for my community, for my daughter. Love is stronger than fear, stronger than anger. Love makes you fight when fighting seems impossible." As the months turned to years, the full scope of the conspiracy continued to unfold. International connections were revealed. Cromwell had been selling extracted resources to foreign governments, potentially compromising national security. The private military contractors were linked to other operations, other cover-ups, a shadow network of corporate enforcement that operated outside the law. Samuel testified at 3 more congressional hearings, each one revealing new layers of corruption. But he always returned to the farm, to the soil that needed tending, the crops that needed harvesting. The work grounded him, reminded him of what really mattered. Emily's career had taken off in ways neither of them could have imagined. She was offered positions at the EPA, the Department of Agriculture, major universities, but she chose to stay in Nebraska, building the teaching farm into a nationally recognized center for environmental justice. She met a young lawyer named David who'd come to help with the legal workshops and never left. Their wedding was held in the Northfield, with Samuel walking her down an aisle made of wheat stalks. Marcus and Helen were there, of course, Helen's cancer in full remission now. Chen came, having left the FBI to head a new federal task force on corporate environmental crimes. Even William Kendrick Jr. sent a letter from prison congratulating Emily and expressing what seemed like genuine remorse for his crimes. "Do you forgive him?" Emily asked her father as they shared a dance at the reception. Samuel thought about it. "I forgive him for what he did to me. But what he did to the land, to all those families, that's not mine to forgive. That's for them to decide." The teaching farm grew beyond anything they'd originally imagined. A dormitory was built to house students. A laboratory was added for advanced soil analysis. A legal clinic was established to help farmers facing corporate exploitation. What had started as one man's fight for his land had become an institution dedicated to protecting all of America's farmland. But success brought new challenges. Corporate interests, though chastened by the prosecutions, hadn't disappeared. They'd simply become more subtle. Shell companies bought land adjacent to the teaching farm, testing the boundaries of the new regulations. Political pressure was applied to reduce funding. Anonymous threats arrived regularly, though none escalated to actual violence. Samuel faced it all with the same steady determination he'd always shown. He was in his 60s now, his hair completely gray, his hands more gnarled from arthritis. But his voice remained strong, his message clear. The land belongs to those who work it, and those who would exploit it for profit will be exposed and stopped. One autumn evening, 5 years after the earthquake, Samuel stood at the memorial Emily had erected at the site of the original crevice. The marker had been joined by others, a sculpture created by a local artist, a garden planted by the community, a bench where visitors could sit and reflect. A young boy approached, maybe 10 years old, with his parents hanging back respectfully. "Are you really Samuel Hale?" he asked, eyes wide with something like awe. "I am," Samuel confirmed, smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. "My teacher says you're a hero, that you saved all the farms." Samuel knelt down to the boy's level, his knees protesting the movement. "I'm not a hero, son. I'm just a farmer who listened when the earth had something to say. The real heroes are all the people who stood up with me, who refused to be silent when silence would have been easier. Could I be like you someday? The boy asked. Samuel looked at the child, seeing in him all the future farmers, scientists, activists who would carry on the fight long after Samuel was gone. You already are, he said. Every time you stand up for what's right, every time you refuse to let someone harm what you love, you're being exactly like me, and probably better. The boy beamed and ran back to his parents, who nodded gratefully at Samuel before leading their son away. Samuel remained at the memorial, watching the sun set over his fields. The wheat was golden in the fading light, ready for harvest. Tomorrow would bring the work of cutting, threshing, storing, the ancient rhythms of agricultural life that connected him to generations past and future. His phone rang. Another farmer, another suspicion of illegal activity, another request for help. Samuel listened, took notes, promised to investigate. It never ended, this work of vigilance. But that was okay. Some fights were worth fighting forever. As darkness fell, Samuel made his way back to the house, the same house where he'd hidden from corporate assassins, where FBI agents had planned raids, where congressional investigators had taken testimony. But it was also the house where Margaret had made Sunday dinners, where Emily had taken her first steps, where 4 generations of Hales had lived and loved and worked the land. In the kitchen, Emily was working on her laptop, analyzing soil samples from the newest suspected contamination site. David was beside her, reviewing legal precedents. They looked up as Samuel entered, and he saw in their faces the same determination that had carried him through the darkest moments of the fight. "Another one?" Emily asked, noting the phone in his hand. "Colorado this time. Mining company, they think. Contaminated groundwater affecting 3 counties." Emily was already pulling up geological surveys of the area. David was researching the company's corporate structure. Within minutes, they had a preliminary assessment and a plan of action. This was the legacy Samuel realized. Not just the prosecutions and the legislation and the cleanup, but the network of vigilance, the community of fighters, the next generation taking up the torch. The earthquake had started it, but what they'd built would outlast them all. As he helped Emily and David plan the Colorado investigation, Samuel thought about Robert Jenkins, the whistleblower who died getting them the crucial video. He thought about all the unknown victims over the decades, the families who'd suffered without knowing why. He thought about Margaret, who'd never lived to see justice done, but whose spirit had sustained him through the fight. They were all part of this now, part of the story that began with an earthquake and would continue long after the last contaminated soil was cleaned. The earth had spoken that March morning, revealing crimes hidden in darkness. But more importantly, it had awakened something in the American heartland, a refusal to be victims, a determination to protect what they loved, a courage that corporate power couldn't buy or intimidate into silence. Samuel looked at his daughter and son-in-law, saw their dedication and brilliance, and knew the fight was in good hands. The phone rang again. Another farmer, another concern, another piece of the vast puzzle of corporate exploitation and rural resistance. He answered it, as he always did, with the words that had become his signature. "This is Samuel Hale. Tell me what you've noticed about your land." Because that's where it always started, with someone paying attention, someone refusing to ignore what felt wrong, someone brave enough to speak when silence would be safer. The earthquake had ended years ago, but its aftershocks continued in every phone call, every investigation, every stand taken against those who would steal from and poison the land. Outside, the wind moved through the wheat, creating waves that looked like a golden ocean in the moonlight. The land was healing slowly but surely, tended by those who loved it. And Samuel Hale, farmer, turned reluctant hero, turned guardian of the heartland, stood ready to defend it for as long as he had breath in his body. The war for America's farmland wasn't over. It might never be truly over. But tonight in this kitchen, where so much had been decided, surrounded by the next generation of fighters, Samuel allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They'd won more than they'd lost. They'd saved more than had been destroyed. And most importantly, they'd shown that ordinary people standing together could face down extraordinary power and prevail. The Colorado investigation would prove to be the one that nearly broke Samuel's spirit. 3 weeks after that evening in the kitchen, he stood at the edge of an abandoned mine shaft in the Rocky Mountain foothills, looking down at something that made even his battle-hardened heart sink. The bodies of 17 wild horses lay at the bottom, poisoned by contaminated water that had seeped from the mine into their drinking source. "How long has this been happening?" he asked the local rancher who'd called him a weathered woman named Catherine Torres, whose family had run cattle in these hills for 90 years. "Started finding dead livestock about 2 years ago," Catherine said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "But the horses that's new last week, my granddaughter found them. She's 8 years old, Mr. Hale. How do I explain to an 8-year-old that someone poisoned the Mustangs she loved to watch?" Emily was already taking water samples, but Samuel could smell it even from here, that chemical tang that had become too familiar, mixed with something else, something that made his skin crawl with primitive warning. "This isn't just mining runoff," David said, reviewing documents on his tablet. "According to the permits, this mine was supposed to be sealed in 1987, but look at these satellite images from last month. The images showed clear signs of recent activity. Fresh tire tracks, new equipment lights, in what should have been an abandoned facility. But it was the thermal imaging that made them all step back from the edge. The mine was hot, much hotter than it should be." "They're processing something down there," Emily said, her voice tight. "Something that requires high heat. Dad, this could be—" She was cut off by the sound of engines approaching fast. Not regular vehicles. These were heavy military grade, their engines growling with barely contained power. Samuel grabbed Emily's arm, ready to run, but Catherine Torres stood her ground. "This is my land," she said firmly. "They have no right to be here." The vehicles that crested the hill weren't military, but they might as well have been. Private security heavily armed, their uniforms bearing no insignia, but their intention clear. The lead vehicle stopped 20 feet away, and a man stepped out who made Samuel's blood run cold. He recognized him from the video. Robert Jenkins had died to deliver Dr. Morrison's assistant, the one who'd taken notes while they discussed cancer rates and cover-ups. The man was younger than Samuel had expected, maybe 40, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that would be forgettable if not for his eyes. They were empty, like looking into a void. "Mr. Hale," the man said, his voice carrying despite the mountain wind. "I'm disappointed. I thought our previous encounters would have taught you the wisdom of minding your own business." "This is Mrs. Torres's land," Samuel said, stepping forward despite every instinct screaming danger. "You're trespassing." The man smiled, an expression that didn't reach those dead eyes. "Actually, we're not. You see, Mrs. Torres doesn't own the mineral rights to her land, haven't since 1943, when her grandfather sold them to cover debts. And we," he gestured to the armed men behind him, "represent the current owners of those rights." Catherine started forward, fury in every line of her body, but David caught her arm. He'd seen what Samuel had seen. Several of the security team had their hands on their weapons, just waiting for an excuse. "Mineral rights don't give you the right to poison the water table," Emily said, her phone in her hand clearly recording. "Or to kill wildlife. That's federal crime." The man's smile widened. "Prove it. Prove we did anything. This mine has been abandoned for decades. Sometimes old mines leak. Tragic, but natural. Unless you have evidence of current operations?" It was a trap, and they all knew it. If they revealed what they knew, what the thermal imaging showed, these men would ensure that evidence never saw the light of day, and probably ensure the same fate for Samuel and his team. "We're leaving," Samuel said quietly. "But this isn't over." "Oh, but it is," the man said. "You see, Mr. Hale, you've become quite famous. A hero to some. But heroes have a weakness. They care about others. And you've inspired so many others to follow your example. The Brennans in Kansas, the Washingtons in Missouri, that lovely family in Arkansas. All of them looking up to you, following your lead." The threat was clear. Back off, or those who'd trusted him would pay the price. As they drove away, Catherine Torres was crying tears of rage and frustration. "They can't do this. This is America. They can't just poison our land and threaten us." "They've been doing it for 70 years, Samuel said quietly. "We just finally started noticing." That night, in their motel room, Emily pulled up everything she could find about the Colorado operation. The shell companies were more sophisticated this time, layers upon layers of corporate veils. But David found something interesting in old courthouse records. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a document from 1943. "The mineral rights were sold, yes, but there's a clause if the mining operations cause substantial harm to surface operations. The rights revert to the surface owner. 17 dead horses seem pretty substantial to me, Emily said. But Samuel was thinking about the man's threat about all the families who'd trusted him, who'd stood up because he'd shown them it was possible. Could he risk their safety for this fight? His phone rang. It was Marcus, and he was panicking. Sam, they've taken Helen. Men came to the house, said she needed to come for follow-up treatment, but the hospital says they never sent anyone. Sam, they took my wife. The world seemed to tilt. Samuel gripped the phone, his knuckles white. When? 2 hours ago. Sam, what do I do? The police say they can't do anything without evidence of a crime. They say she probably went willingly, that I'm overreacting. Samuel looked at Emily, and David saw his own horror reflected in their faces. The man at the mine hadn't been making idle threats. We're coming home, Samuel said. Right now, and Marcus, call Chen. Call everyone. They want a war. They just got one. The drive back to Nebraska was the longest of Samuel's life. Emily worked her phone, constantly rallying their network. David coordinated with law enforcement contacts, trying to find any trace of Helen. But it was Catherine Torres, still in Colorado, who provided the breakthrough. Mr. Hale, she called, her voice excited. My ranch hand Miguel, he saw them. The vehicles that took Mrs. Boyd, they stopped for gas at the station near the county line. He got video on his phone. License plates, faces, everything. Within hours, Agent Chen had mobilized a federal task force. The plates were traced to a private security firm with ties to the same network that had tried to assault the farm. But more importantly, Chen's team had been monitoring communications since the Cromwell arrest, and they'd picked up chatter about a containment action in Nebraska. They're holding her at an abandoned industrial facility outside Omaha, Chen told Samuel as FBI agents geared up for the raid. We're going to get her back. The raid was swift and successful. Helen was found unharmed but sedated, held in what amounted to a makeshift medical facility. 3 men were arrested, including the dead-eyed man from Colorado, whose name turned out to be Michael Stratton, former CIA operative turned corporate fixer. But Helen's kidnapping had been a mistake, the desperate action that brought everything crashing down. The public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. The story of a cancer survivor kidnapped to silence her husband's friend captured national attention in a way that complex environmental crimes never could. More importantly, it gave federal prosecutors the leverage they needed. The arrested men were facing kidnapping charges, federal kidnapping of a witness in an ongoing investigation. They were looking at life in prison, and they knew it. Michael Stratton broke first. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he provided everything: names, dates, locations, methods. The Colorado mine wasn't just processing ore. It was a disposal site for radioactive waste shipped in from medical facilities and research centers dumped into the abandoned shafts without any containment or safety measures. The scope was staggering. Hundreds of sites across the country. Thousands of tons of hazardous waste, decades of illegal dumping that made the Kendrick Energy crimes look almost quaint by comparison. But it was Stratton's revelation about the true power behind it all that shocked even the hardened investigators. The conspiracy wasn't run by corporations or corrupt government officials. It was run by a shadow organization that Stratton called the Trust, a group of the ultra-wealthy who viewed rural America as nothing more than a dumping ground for the waste products of their prosperity. They own senators, Stratton said during his recorded confession. They own judges. They own entire government departments, and they own the land under your feet, whether you know it or not. The names he provided read like a who's who of American wealth. Tech billionaires, pharmaceutical dynasties, old money families, whose names adorned university buildings and hospital wings. These weren't just criminals, they were the people who shaped American society, who sat on boards of directors, who attended White House dinners. Samuel sat in the FBI office listening to Stratton's confession and felt something he hadn't experienced even in the darkest moments of his fight despair. How could they fight something this big, this entrenched, this powerful? It was Emily who pulled him back from the edge. "Dad," she said, taking his hands in hers, "remember what you told that little boy at the memorial? Every time someone stands up for what's right, they become a hero. Well, look around. Look at what you've built." She was right. The task force had grown from a handful of FBI agents to a multi-agency operation involving the EPA, ATF, DEA, and even the military. The network of farmers and activists had expanded internationally, with environmental groups from Europe and Asia offering support. The media attention was constant and unrelenting. But more than that, the American people were angry, really angry. The kidnapping of Helen Boyd, a grandmother and cancer survivor, had crystallized years of frustration about corporate power and government corruption. Protests erupted in major cities. Boycotts targeted companies connected to the trust. Citizens began showing up at town halls, congressional offices, demanding action. The first resignation came within a week, the EPA director who'd been in Cromwell's pocket. Then a senator, another senator, a federal judge. The dominoes were falling, and the trust's carefully constructed wall of protection was crumbling, but they wouldn't go down without a fight. The attack came on a clear Tuesday morning. Samuel was in the barn, the same barn where this had all started, when he heard Emily scream. He ran toward the house, finding her in the kitchen, her laptop screen showing a live news feed. A massive explosion had destroyed the federal courthouse in Omaha, where the grand jury was meeting to consider indictments against the trust members. 17 people were dead, including 3 prosecutors who'd been working on the case. "They're calling it a terrorist attack," Emily said, her voice shaking. "They're blaming environmental extremists. Dad, they're trying to flip the narrative, make us the villains." Samuel's phone rang. It was Chen, and she sounded grimmer than he'd ever heard her. "Samuel, you need to see this. Check your email." The email contained a single video file. Samuel opened it to find himself looking at footage he didn't remember being filmed him at the Colorado mine, but edited to make it look like he was planting something. The audio had been manipulated to have him saying things he'd never said, making threats he'd never made. "It's a deepfake," Emily said immediately. "We can prove it's fake." "Can you prove it before the damage is done?" Chen asked. "They're going to release this in an hour along with similar videos of other activists. They're going to claim you're all part of an eco-terrorist cell, that the courthouse bombing was your doing." Samuel felt the walls closing in. They'd fought so hard, come so far, only to be facing the one weapon they couldn't counter, lies backed by unlimited resources and sophisticated technology. But then Marcus spoke up. He'd been quiet since Helen's rescue, staying close to her, but now his voice was strong and clear. "Then we tell the truth louder than they tell lies," he said. "Sam, remember what your grandfather used to say. When the storm comes, you don't run from it. You face it head on." Within 30 minutes, Samuel was standing in front of cameras in his own field, the memorial to the earthquake discovery behind him. Emily and David flanked him, Marcus and Helen too, along with dozens of other farmers who dropped everything to stand with him. "In less than an hour," Samuel began, his voice carrying across the assembled media, "you're going to see videos that claim to show me and others planning acts of terrorism. These videos are fake, created by the same people who poisoned our land, who kidnapped Helen Boyd, who murdered 17 people in Omaha today to prevent their prosecution." He held up a USB drive. "This contains the technical analysis proving the videos are deep fakes. But more than that, it contains something the trust doesn't want you to see: their own communications decoded by the FBI, planning the courthouse attack, planning the frame-up, planning to turn the American people against those fighting for clean land and water." It was a gamble. The FBI hadn't authorized the release of the decoded communications. Chen could lose her job, maybe face prosecution herself. But sometimes Samuel had learned you had to break the rules to reveal the truth. The response was immediate and overwhelming. News outlets ran side-by-side comparisons of the real footage and the deepfakes. Technical experts confirmed the manipulation. The decoded trust communications were authenticated by multiple sources. But the trust had one more card to play. That night, as Samuel sat with Emily and David planning their next move, the lights went out. Not just at the farm across 3 states, a massive power grid failure that authorities would later blame on a cyber attack. In the darkness, the trust's private military forces moved. They came for Samuel, for Emily, for Marcus, for every prominent voice in the movement. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd underestimated rural America's ability to function without power. Catherine Torres, still in Colorado, saw the power go out and immediately understood what was happening. Using an old ham radio powered by a generator, she sent out the alert. Farmers across the Midwest responded using CB radios, generators, and old-fashioned phone trees to coordinate. When the trust forces arrived at the Hale farm, They found not a family sleeping in darkness, but a community ready for them. Dozens of pickup trucks surrounded the property, their headlights creating a blazing perimeter. Farmers with hunting rifles stood ready not to attack, but to witness to record with battery-powered cameras to ensure that whatever happened would be seen. The standoff lasted until dawn when the power was finally restored, and with it, communication systems. The footage of private military forces retreating in the face of united rural resistance went viral within hours. The image of Samuel Hale standing in his doorway with his community behind him became iconic the moment when ordinary Americans said, "Enough." The arrests that followed were swift and decisive. The cyber attack had been traced, the private military forces identified and detained. Members of the trust trying to flee the country were arrested at airports and private airfields. The conspiracy that had seemed so invincible was collapsing under the weight of its own desperation. But for Samuel, the real victory came in a quieter moment. He was sitting in the Omaha hospital where Helen was receiving her regular cancer treatment properly, this time without fear of kidnapping or coercion. Marcus was there, of course, holding his wife's hand. Emily and David were in the corner working on legal briefs for the upcoming trials. Agent Chen entered looking exhausted but satisfied. "We got them," she said simply. "All of them. The trust is finished." "No," Samuel corrected gently. "The trust as it existed is finished. But there will always be those who see our land as something to exploit our communities, as something to sacrifice for profit. The fight doesn't end. It just changes form." Chen nodded, understanding. "So what's next for you?" "Back to farming." Samuel looked out the window at the city skyline, then at his daughter, his friends, the small but fierce family this fight had created. "Yes," he said, "back to farming, but also forward to teaching, to watching, to making sure this never happens again. The earthquake showed us what was hidden beneath our feet. Now we know to keep looking, to keep listening, to keep fighting when necessary." Helen, weak but alert, squeezed Marcus's hand. "And to keep living," she added. "They tried to use fear to silence us. The best revenge is to live fully, freely, without fear." As Samuel drove home that evening, the sun setting over fields that were finally truly clean, he thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that first earthquake tremor to this moment of tentative victory, it had been a path he never could have imagined. The farm looked different now. The teaching center Emily had built dominated the southern area where the crevice had been. The memorial had grown into a garden that attracted visitors from around the world. The house rebuilt after the attack stood stronger than before. But some things remained unchanged. The soil still needed tending. The crops still needed harvesting. The ancient rhythms of agricultural life continued, indifferent to the human dramas that played out above them. Samuel walked through his fields as darkness fell, running his hands through the wheat, feeling the health of the land in every stalk. Behind him, the lights of the teaching center glowed warm, filled with young people learning not just to farm, but to protect what they farmed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The trials would be long and complex. The cleanup would take decades. The vigilance could never cease. But tonight, Samuel Hale stood in his fields on land that 4 generations of his family had worked, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. The earthquake had ended. The immediate fight was won. The corruption was exposed. The criminals arrested, the land beginning to heal. It wasn't a complete victory, such things never were, but it was enough. Enough to build on, enough to hope on, enough to plant next season's crops with confidence that they would grow in clean soil. As he walked back to the house, Samuel saw Emily through the kitchen window, laughing at something David had said. She caught sight of her father and waved, her face bright with the knowledge that they had not just survived, but triumphed. Samuel waved back, then paused at the memorial one last time. The inscription had been his idea, simple words that captured everything. Here the earth spoke truth to power. Here power finally listened. But someone had added another line, recently carved with less skill but equal determination, and here the people ensured it would never be silenced again. Samuel smiled, recognizing Marcus's handiwork. His friend was right. The real monument wasn't the stone or the garden or even the teaching center. It was the network of vigilant citizens who would never again assume their land was safe, their water clean, their leaders honest without verification. The earthquake that had shaken his farm that March morning had ended. But the awakening it triggered would continue for generations, a permanent shift in the relationship between rural America and those who would exploit it. The earth had spoken, the people had listened, and together they had changed everything. As Samuel entered his house joining his daughter and son-in-law for a simple dinner of food grown in clean soil, he thought one last time about Margaret. She would have been proud, he knew. Proud of Emily. Proud of the fight. Proud of the community that had rallied to defend itself. But mostly she would have been proud that through it all Samuel had remained what he'd always been: a farmer, a father, a man who worked the land and protected what he loved. The earthquake had revealed crimes beneath his feet, but it had also revealed strength within himself and his community that no force, no matter how powerful or corrupt, could ultimately defeat. The sun disappeared completely, leaving only starlight over the Nebraska plains. Inside the farmhouse, 3 generations of fighters against corporate corruption shared a meal and planned for a future where such fights might not be necessary. Outside, the land stretched peaceful and healing toward the horizon, bearing its scars with dignity, ready for whatever seeds tomorrow would bring.